I'm sure where I'm supposed to go with the question, actually. I'll just start with a quick anecdote. Last September, I escorted a couple of teenage migrants, refugees, to the United States to be resettled into a small town in the plains. Town of about 120,000 people, 98% white, very monolithic kind of space. And so these two 16-year-olds who want to be doctors and lawyers and engineers and have all kinds of hopes and dreams, really inspiring young men, they step off the aircraft and they're handed over to the agency that's going to resettle them and take care of them for the next couple of years. Following morning, I'm walking down the street, there's a newspaper box, increasingly rare to find a newspaper box. I was enchanted, so I opened up the newspaper box and pulled out the local rag. And the front image on it was, above the fold, was just storm clouds shot through with lightning and this sort of forlorn road heading off to nowhere. In the bottom right corner, there was a guy's face cut off at the nose, just the top of his head to his nose. Very foreboding sort of image. And the headline was, North Dakota's first refugee family arrives from Syria. And I thought to myself, I went and had my coffee and had my breakfast, and I kept going back to this image and thinking about how powerful and how negative this image was for the ordinary person walking down the street, stopping at the paper box in a small town in North Dakota. And it really got me thinking about language and the way that these sorts of issues are presented. I managed to suppress my desire to go to the newspaper office, knock on the door, and sit down and have a cup of coffee with the managing editor and ask him what the thought processes were behind that. But I think these thought processes are being repeated time and time and time again all over the world. Tom and others have covered off some of the language that we read and we hear. They didn't mention floods and hordes and mobs, the criminals, the rapists, the jihadis. All these sort of these negative signs that are being
bad hombres
that are being hung around people's necks before they're even given a chance to sort of explain themselves. So there's that kind of language, which is the responsibility of editors and journalists and media institutions that really need to find a way to tell the story in a different way. And it's very difficult. Market forces are at play. They're playing to a certain constituency, and perhaps maybe a constituency that no amount of media training and awareness raising and campaigning is ever truly going to affect. You have your true believers set in their ways. And for that reason, for those of us who see the positive, who see the acceptance of refugees into our countries as being a net positive, who see migration as being a net positive, we have very few arrows, as it were, in our quiver. We have very few things that on the development aid side of things and within the journalism community that we can use. And one of the things that we can use is accuracy in the language that we use to describe people. There are divergent opinions on this. I imagine we're going to hear some of them. But, refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, these are technical terms. The refugee is a technical term for somebody. The push and pull factors, the things that are going on globally now, unparalleled really since the Second World War, the drivers are manifold. Not everybody is fleeing war in Syria. There are famine, disease, labor, a huge draw on migrants. People simply looking for better economic activities. I think it's really important for us on the development side, and working maybe with people like Tom and his organization and others, to help journalists to better understand what the nuances are in that nomenclature. Because it's really important to call a spade, if you like.
Really great points. The next two people who are going to talk are basically journalists who have got it right. And I'll start with Margie, because she won the Pulitzer as part of a team that identified people who were human trafficked for basically slave labor. And one of the key points here is it wasn't just telling the story of the slave labor, but it was also telling the story of where the goods ended up. And that had tremendous impact. So I will let her talk about that story and why it was so impactful.
Well, actually, that story kind of, it came from another story. I was working with a colleague, Robin McDowell. She was based in Myanmar at the time, and she and I were working on a Rohingya story, looking at children who were fleeing Rakhine State alone. And a little girl who was 10 years old ended up here in Indonesia. And so we were at the IOM talking to our friends there and trying to get some information about Rohingya and some data. And when I was there, I was told, you know, maybe you want to look at these migrant fishermen who are coming from different places in Southeast Asia and kind of ending up abandoned or stuck here in Indonesia. And I knew about this. We all had been in the region for a long time. I think those of us who have covered any issues involving trafficking, know that there's been a long-standing problem with men being trafficked from places like Myanmar and Cambodia, Thailand and Laos onto fishing boats and getting stuck. And so I looked at the data and I went back and I called Robin and I said, okay, maybe we want to look at this. It's an open secret. We know it exists. And so we said, okay, let's take a look. But we need to do two things. And they were very ambitious. One, we wanted to do something that other journalists had not really done. And that was, we wanted to try to find men who were captive, who were being held somewhere against their will. And we also, from the very beginning, were very mindful and clear that if we found these men, we wanted to trace their fish and their seafood back to Europe and back to the US. And we wanted to be very meticulous and very specific. And we wanted to name names because we felt like this is the only way to really put pressure on the industry and to really shine a light on this problem that, again, had been occurring for decades. And so this was 2014, I guess. We spent about almost a year, digging and clawing and interviewing everybody we could find and really just doing what journalists do. And we were doing that on top of our day jobs. So we were covering, whatever plane crashes and earthquakes or whatever else was happening in our countries and doing this on the side. And eventually we kind of heard that there was this island in a very, very remote corner of eastern Indonesia called Benchina. And we heard that there might be some guys there, quite a few guys. And so we went there and checked it out, and what we found was really astounding. We found men locked in cages, in a cage. We found a graveyard filled with bodies, and the markers were, they weren't their names, they weren't their nationalities. Even in death, they were not given the dignity of their own nationalities or names. We found men on boats, literally crying and pleading to us over the side of their trawlers and saying, please help us, take us home. Men were running after, and this was Robin McDowell and Esther Tucson were the two on Benchina at the time, but they were men running after them, stuffing pictures of themselves and little scraps of paper into their hands and saying, please, please, go back to Myanmar and find my parents and tell them that I am alive and I am in Indonesia and I cannot come home to them. These men were forced to work 22-hour days, sometimes 24-hour days. They were beaten with iron rods. They were beaten with stingray tails. They were locked up simply for asking to go home. They were not paid either. These were Thai boats. These were that had come to Indonesia. These men had all come from very poor places in the region, and they were looking for opportunity. They were poor, and they had been told that there were jobs in Thailand. In some cases, they were tricked. In other cases, they were drugged and put onto boats, and they simply woke up at sea with no way to escape these floating prisons. So we got the story, and we could have just published when we found this island. It was incredibly dramatic, but we, and AP was very much behind this as well. All of us, Martha Mendoza in California was working with us as well, and we all said, no, we want to trace this seafood. Robin and Esther had seen the seafood being put onto a ship. We used satellites, we tracked it, we went to Thailand, we followed it for 4 nights and watched where it was being delivered. And then Martha dug in and started building databases and started tracking exactly where that seafood was going. And it went everywhere, to the supply chains of Walmart, Whole Foods, Albertsons, Kroger, to the pet food Fancy Feast, Imes, Meow Mix. We found it just basically going everywhere. And when we published, we named names, and afterward, it was an incredible impact. Within, I think, a little more than a week, the Indonesian fishery minister here, Ibu Susi, she was very upset, and they launched a task force to go and check it out to see if what we had reported was true. And when they got there, they found the situation was indeed as serious as we had reported, and they launched a rescue right then and there. And over the course of 2015, there were more than 2,000 men across in various islands that were freed as a result, in part from our reporting. So I think that the lesson is that you can, we can have an impact. It's good to have an ambitious project and to follow through with the supply chain. Supply chain, I think, is extremely important.
That was an amazing story. Kind of chokes me up just to listen to it again. But the supply chain, did the big companies start looking into their supply chain and do anything about correcting? I mean, obviously they're not going to keep buying from those people, but was there anything rushed into really examining where the food comes from?
Yeah, there was a lot of work that was done on this. Audits were done. I think a lot of the companies really tried to put pressure on the Thai companies and also the Thai government. I mean, this is a $7 billion industry. Now, I would like to sit here and say today that the problem has been solved and that this no longer happens, but that is not true. It is still happening every day. This is something that's been going on for generations, but at least now, no one can say that they don't know. No one can plead ignorance. Everybody knows. The cat is literally out of the bag. So I think for us, it was just really important to shine this light, and there had been other work, other journalists had done work on this as well, and I think now there's a body of work, and no one can ignore it, and there's a lot of money being spent now, I think, and a lot of time being spent trying to focus on this problem.
If I could just add on to that, oftentimes in the media, we pour a lot of time and energy into a particular story, and it hits the wall, and it gets a bit of traction, and it gets some coverage, and then a couple months later, everybody just goes back to sleep. And you wonder to yourself, whether have we affected change? What has actually changed? Well, this is one of the cases where things did change. I can't speak to the supply chain issue, though I understand that some of the larger international conglomerates are taking a much closer view of their supply chain issues and putting pressure on suppliers. But domestically here in Indonesia, Margie mentioned the creation of Task Force 115, which is a significant step in the right direction in a very complex sector, which in the Indonesian context, like all extraction-based industries, indeed not just in Indonesia, but elsewhere, produces a huge amount of wealth, a large portion of which ends up in the pockets not of workers and communities, but in the pockets of other actors. And a second thing that came down from their investigation, beyond the return of these 2,000 enslaved fishermen, was an attempt by the government here to create and now to enforce compliance of a human rights audit for any vessel operating in Indonesian waters. Now, there's two sides to this story. First of all, it's very important. Indonesia doesn't have a great fleet of ships. It's not like Korea or Taiwan where they're sailing the oceans capturing fish. A lot of it's done by rebranded foreign vessels in Indonesian waters. But there's a movement now firmly afoot with legislative support to actually force vessels and their owners to comply with an audit to ensure that workers are properly documented, that they're living in relatively humane conditions, that they are being paid, that they are allowed to have contact with their families, these types of things. So these are really positive steps that the government has taken as a direct consequence of the series of stories that AP put together and a body of work that was done before AP took the big bite out of it back in 2015.
Yes, this is a number 10 on that scale of 1 to 10, or maybe 12. Another example of excellent coverage has been by Al Jazeera English. Why don't you talk a little bit about why your coverage has been effective and distinctive